So the initial infection or exploit is often conducted through a variety of different means, right? Some of the things like carrier files, PDFs, or executables are probably what you're most familiar with. There's also web exploits which exist, right? JavaScript exploits, Flash, things like that. You'll have particular software vulnerabilities, SQL, which we kind of talked about earlier on. We were talking about kind of scanning and stuff like that, as well as web applications, IIS or Apache may have a particular vulnerability. There may be an open or an operating system vulnerability that hasn't been patched yet or hasn't been applied to the system. You can look at things like physical devices, right? That was actually a big issue for a while, where there was basically people were you could install malware onto a thumb drive, and the link file stuff is the link file stuff, right?
There's all the U3 files.
U3 stuff as well, right? Kind of the auto run issues that you had, which has kind of been resolved by Windows now, as they kind of don't do auto run, which makes sense. And then you kind of have some of the more kind of like manual things, like social engineering, like asking somebody for their password, right? Things like that, as well as some sort of manual exploit where you're kind of modifying code or modifying something to get to do your function. And but often it's a combination of multiple ones of those. Then eventually, once you actually perform your initial exploit, right, whether it be a web redirection or something like that, it's going to do something like download a file onto the system and cause the payload to run, right? You're typically going to have some sort of connection back to a command and control server or a C2 server, which is basically going to handle communications. This is going to give, if for lack of a better term, going to give the malware updates, perhaps, changes to the configuration file, new commands that would be given to that to say run this as opposed to whatever else you're currently running. This is a common mechanism too to kind of change the way the malware gets detected. So it's now a different command that's being sent to it. So now it won't necessarily, the signatures or network signatures, something like that, to block it won't necessarily be detected. So oftentimes they'll use just communications over port 80 because everybody has port 80 open pretty much, right? So it makes sense to use that. If you're trying to use some sort of odd port, it might get blocked by a firewall. But most people don't block port 80, right? People want to access the internet. So something to kind of keep in mind. That it may you'll have this illegitimate communication kind of commingled with your legitimate stuff. And then eventually you're going to have kind of your end result, your stage 3, which is ultimately your payload that's going to execute on the system. This can be downloading additional malware, running additional malware, unpacking things onto the system, part of a suite, based on what operating system it is. If it's Windows XP, we load this malware. If it's Windows 7, we load this one, so on and so forth. And eventually this is what's going to kind of complete the ultimate objective, right? Grabbing keystrokes, passwords, sniffing packets, remote shell, things like that. So, this is probably not news to anybody, but there are multiple objectives that are associated with hackers. The biggest one that a lot of you will probably deal with is the financial aspect of things, right? Just because, crime pays when it comes to cybercrime, right? You can make a lot of money in a short period of time. But they may also be doing it to damage it, right? This could be something like a DDoS attack to prevent access to the systems and things like that would hurt a company, right? For example, like Amazon, if they can't take orders for 10 minutes, that's probably millions of dollars that they're losing, right? Think about that over the course of a day or whatever. Ultimately, they may want to exfiltrate data, right? It's something that's PII or kind of trade secrets or something like that they want to get access to and sell. They could be doing destruction, want to actually cause damage to the company, as well as performing some sort of scam. This is usually kind of associated with some sort of financial gain. And sometimes just to be a nuisance, right? That's kind of Anonymous's thing, right? They seem to be more kind of trying to disrupt it, although they will say that they're trying to improve security, right, through insecurity, I guess. They think that ultimately they basically just act as a nuisance. So some of the mechanisms that are used to prevent detection are like turning off antivirus, right? So I have antivirus installed on protected, right? Well, not if it's off, right? Or they'll prevent it from getting updated, which means that it won't get new signatures for their malware, which hasn't been added to the signature set yet. Or do some reconfiguration. They'll do things like detect that they're in a virtual machine. That's mostly from a debugging or a kind of analysis standpoint later on. They'll use they'll kind of intermingle themselves or give names that appear to look legitimate, right? Like service host or something like that. They'll kind of disguise themselves from browser helper objects. This is something we talked about earlier, right? Where they get loaded into the web browser. I think only IE has browser helper objects, but in any event, they may call them something else in different platforms. But basically, they'll get loaded by the browser, every time that they're loading, so they can do things like read keystrokes or passwords or website visitation and things like that. And they'll also do things. This is kind of one of the things we talked about earlier. They'll do hacking or encryption, obfuscation. That's a common mechanism to kind of avoid antivirus detection and things like that. I also want to kind of talk about the modified timestamps. That's quite often that they'll do that to kind of blend in with older files and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about time modification and things like that later on when we get into timelining.